Death in this world rarely wore the shape of a bullet. More often it came dressed as courtesy, poured, smoked, and handed over with a smile. Tonight, somewhere beneath the old brick warehouses of Seattle, a man was about to drink from a glass that was never meant for him, and the one about to save his life wouldn't be a bodyguard, wouldn't be a soldier, wouldn't be anyone paid to watch his back at all. It would be the one woman at the table nobody had bothered to look at twice. Rain swept sideways across Pioneer Square. Down in the basement of a converted 19th century. Her name was Leah Sullivan, 27 years old, soft waves of chestnut hair, pale green eyes, a light scatter of freckles across her nose. Her body was full and curved, and the tight black uniform did nothing to hide it, and everything to expose it to men who never looked at her long enough to notice anything else. She had worked at the Black Anchor for 3 years. Nobody remembered her real name. She had become something like furniture in the room, and that was exactly what made her dangerous. Because nobody guards their tongue around furniture, she heard everything cargo manifests moving through the port of Seattle, discussed over her shoulder, like she wasn't standing there at all, whispered envelopes changing hands 2 feet from where she poured water. She remembered every word because 2 years ago, her only brother Ethan, 24, an accountant with a careful, quiet mind, had been struck by a car outside his office on a rain-slicked street. The police called it a hit and run. Nobody was ever charged. Leah was the only family Ethan had left. His hospital paperwork had listed her as emergency contact and financial guardian for 2 years, which meant every strange note in his medical file eventually crossed her kitchen table. And one line from that file had never left her a trace of an unidentified chemical compound in his bloodstream drawn hours before the car ever hit him. Nobody in that ER had ever explained why a hit-and-run victim would test positive for anything at all. Tonight, Table 4 was different from any other night. At the head of it sat Wyatt Reynolds, 33, a Mafia boss who had just finished cutting the rot out of his own organization. Dark suit, white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a black rose tattoo curling up his neck, and a broken compass inked across the back of his right hand. His eyes missed nothing. Across from him sat Bradford Ellis, 58, a heavy-set capo who controlled fuel pipeline routes through the Pacific Northwest, routes that in quieter conversations among men who moved product for a living were known to connect further south to buyers nobody asked too many questions about. Gold rings crowded every finger. Before the first course was even served, Bradford leaned toward a well-dressed younger man seated one table over and shook his hand once, briefly, like men do when a debt has already been agreed on. That man was Grant Whitaker, Wyatt's cousin. Nobody at Table 4 thought to notice. When Leah brought the appetizers, Bradford let his eyes drag slowly down her uniform, then laughed loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Good God, look at this dress! About to burst at the seams, they hirin' by the pound now?" The table laughed with him. Leah didn't flinch. She set every plate down without spilling a drop, then said quietly but clearly, "Enjoy your evening, gentlemen." As she turned to go, the low light caught the cuff of the bartender's sleeve. Quinn Parker. And there, just above his wrist, was a thin V-shaped scar, the exact shape she'd read in Ethan's file 18 months ago, filed under an injury no doctor could explain. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her tray. The man pouring drinks tonight had a mark on his body that matched a wound in her brother's medical history. Bradford agreed to the new protection terms far too easily, smiling like a man who had already placed a bet he knew he'd win. Somewhere at this table, a debt from 2 years ago was about to come due, and the only person who knew it hadn't been paid was the woman nobody in the room had bothered to look at twice. Leah pressed her back against a brick column near the service station, the cold of it seeping through her uniform and settling into her spine. Somewhere behind her, glassware clinked against a tray, and the low murmur of table conversation blurred into a single wall of sound, the kind of noise a room makes right before something in it breaks. Quinn had already poured 3 glasses of whiskey. The one meant for the Mafia boss sat closest on the silver tray, easiest to reach first. She watched his hands as he worked, and for the first time in 3 years, she actually watched him instead of simply registering that he existed. His fingers weren't steady. A man who'd poured 10,000 drinks in this room had no reason for his fingers to shake, pouring an 11th. Under the bar light, she caught a glint beneath Quinn's fingernail, a fine white powder, dissolving fast into the amber liquid, gone before it could ever be proven to have existed. Not street poison. She'd seen enough of that dumped into gutters behind the club to know its color, its grain. This was something cleaner, something that wanted to disappear the moment it did its work. The same compound from Ethan's file. Her pulse didn't spike the way she expected it to. It went quiet instead, the way a held breath goes quiet, and in that stillness a memory surfaced, whole and uninvited. 18 months ago, a drunk regular had cornered her near the kitchen, one hand braced against the wall beside her head, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on him. She remembered the particular helplessness of being trapped by a man twice her size in a hallway nobody checked. Wyatt, then still a rising capo, not yet the man who ran the room, had walked past on his way to the bar. He hadn't stopped walking. He'd simply said 4 words flat without even turning his head fully toward them. "She's working. Back off." The man had peeled away like he'd been burned. No one had touched her since. She hadn't thought about it in months. She thought about it now, watching his tattooed hand rest near an untouched glass 40 feet away, and wondered distantly if that had been the first brick in whatever was about to be built between them. As she stepped toward the tray, one of Bradford's bodyguards shifted his weight and blocked her path, close enough that she caught the smell of his cologne, sharp and cheap. "Move it," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "This table doesn't need staff opinions hovering around it." Leah didn't argue. Arguing was a luxury for people who got to be seen as more than furniture. "I'm assigned to this table," she said, even and flat. "Take it up with the manager." She stepped past him, spine straight, and felt his eyes on her back the whole way. Not the leering kind of attention she was used to, but something closer to suspicion, like he'd noticed for half a second that she hadn't flinched the way he expected her to. That half second nearly cost her everything. Quinn's phone was propped against the brass rail of the bar screen, angled toward the floor she was crossing, the light from it pale and blue against the dark wood. It lit once, a soft buzz swallowed by the ambient noise of the room. 3 words stark against the lock screen. "Confirm the fat one is serving." She read it in a single glance, the way you read a word you've been dreading your whole life the moment it finally appears in front of you. Something cold moved through her chest, not just fear, but a strange, sharpened clarity. Someone had specifically named her role in whatever was about to happen, had built a plan detailed enough to account for exactly which server would be carrying exactly which tray. Which meant, if the glass got switched, whoever wrote that message would have built their entire plan around the wrong assumption. They had accounted for everything except the possibility that the furniture might move on its own. For one breath, she let herself imagine simply walking away, out the service door into the rain, and never looking back at a room that had spent 3 years calling her the fat one under its breath, and never once bothering to learn her name. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have even noticed she was gone until the tray hit the floor without her. She thought of Ethan instead, the particular careful way he used to sort his silverware before eating, the last normal thing she remembered about him before the hospital, before the machines, before 2 years of visiting a body that couldn't visit her back. She thought about the fact that whoever had written that text message on Quinn's phone might be the same hands one link removed that had put her brother in that bed in the first place. She made her decision. No stumble, no scene. She dropped a clean napkin at Bradford's feet, a small, forgettable clatter of fabric against marble, and in the half-second, the table leaned to look, glasses clinking as elbows shifted. She rotated the tray in one smooth motion, the clean glass toward Wyatt, the marked one settling in front of Bradford instead. Her hands didn't shake until it was already done. Wyatt didn't drink. He looked up at her one fast second, dark eyes catching the low amber light, then rested a tattooed finger against his own glass without lifting it, a gesture so small that no one else at the table registered it at all. It wasn't curiosity in his eyes. It was the look of a man who just watched the board flip under his hand and was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else, still holding their cards. Somewhere behind her, Grant Whitaker checked his phone once quickly, the way a man checks his watch when he's expecting a call that hasn't come yet. Leah didn't understand the significance of it in the moment. She would later. If you were standing behind that tray, knowing one wrong glass could kill a man who'd never once been kind to you, would you have switched it to save him, or let the drink pour itself? Answer in one line. Save him or let him drink. Bradford lifted his glass, the ice inside it clinking once against the crystal, catching the low bar light in a small, careless gleam. To the new arrangement, he said, and drained it in one pull, the way a man drinks when he has never once in his life had reason to check what's been poured in front of him. For a moment, nothing happened. Leah's whole body went rigid, waiting. Then the room didn't have time to process what happened next. There was a sound of a chair going over glass shattering against marble, a wet, heavy thud that the jazz music couldn't quite cover, and by the time anyone turned to look, Bradford Ellis was already on the floor, one hand clawed against his own collar, and he did not get back up. The black anchor exploded into screaming chairs, scraping back hard enough to gouge the floor, bodies scrambling for the exits in a current Leah could feel through the soles of her shoes. Wyatt didn't stand. He didn't reach for a weapon. In a room coming apart at the seams, he sat with his hands loose on the table, and for one long second, he simply turned his head toward the shadow where Leah stood trembling against the brick wall, and gave the smallest possible nod, barely visible, swallowed by the chaos around them, but enough. I know. Wyatt doesn't move to act right away, not out of coldness, but because a mafia boss survives by calculating before he reacts. That single nod is his inner conflict made visible. Everything in him wants to protect her immediately, but he knows one wrong move in a room full of witnesses could unravel the very protection he's about to build for her. Bradford's phone had slid from his jacket as he fell, skittering across the floor to stop near the leg of an overturned chair. The screen was still lit, glowing up through the chaos like something that wanted to be found. In the noise and scattering bodies, Leah caught a glimpse of the last message on it, sent minutes earlier from a contact saved only as GW. It's done. Enjoy the meal. She didn't touch the phone. Every instinct told her that whatever those 2 initials meant, they weren't hers to hold yet. Not in a room this crowded, not with this many eyes that might, for the first time tonight, actually start looking her way. She memorized the initials instead, burned them into the same part of her mind that had held Ethan's medical file for 2 years, and kept walking. Bradford's bodyguard drew his gun, the metallic scrape of it against his holster cutting through the screaming. Wyatt's men raised theirs in response, a half-dozen barrels suddenly leveled across a room that 10 seconds earlier had been discussing pipeline terms over appetizers. Quinn, still behind the bar, panicked and tried to bolt for the service door and caught a bullet in the leg from Bradford's own security before anyone could stop it. A wet crack of sound, a scream that didn't belong to him alone. One of the henchmen, wild-eyed, swept his gaze across the room and landed on Leah pressed against the brick and laughed, short, ugly, the kind of laugh men use to steady their own hands. "Look at her, frozen stiff. Somebody find the poor thing a chair before she goes down too." She didn't look away, though every muscle in her body was screaming at her to. "I'm still standing right here," she said, and her voice cut clean through the noise in a way that surprised even her. "You should be worried about your own boss." Something in the way she said it made the man's laugh die halfway out of his throat. He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Wyatt rose from the table, then, unhurried, even now, unbuttoning his collar with 2 fingers, the black rose tattoo fully visible under the low light. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the chaos like a blade through wet paper. "Find the waitress. Bring her to me before sunrise." Behind him, one of his men was already moving toward the shadow near the brick column, but the shadow was already empty. Leah had slipped toward the service exit the moment his voice carried across the room, some old animal instinct telling her that being found by the wrong hands in the next 60 seconds could undo everything the last 5 minutes had accomplished. Leah made it as far as the back door before she saw the black Escalade already waiting in the rain. If a Mafia boss sent a car for you the same night his rival died at your hands, would you get in or run? The Escalade smelled like leather and rain. Leah sat with her hands pressed flat against her knees, watching the city blur past the window, streetlights smearing gold across wet glass, the sound a black mirror somewhere beyond the buildings. Nobody spoke. The driver never once looked at her in the rearview mirror, which somehow frightened her more than if he had. By the time they reached the tower on Elliott Bay, her legs had stopped shaking, replaced by something colder and steadier. Fear, she was learning, had a shelf life. After enough of it, the body simply switched to something else. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lit low in gold, and then into a penthouse where the whole west wall was glass Elliott Bay laid out beneath the storm ferry lights crawling slow across the black water. Wyatt was already there, jacket gone, sleeves still rolled to the elbow, the black rose and the broken compass stark under the recessed lighting. He didn't turn around right away. He was looking at the water like it owed him an answer. "You've seen too much tonight," he said finally, still facing the glass. "Now you're on this side of the line." "I didn't ask to be on any side," Leah said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. That made him turn. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the only sound in the room was the rain ticking against the window and the low hum of the building settling around them. He studied her the way she imagined he studied everyone, cataloging, weighing, deciding what she was worth to him before deciding what she meant to him. Then something in his face shifted, small and almost involuntary, like a man recalculating a number he'd already written down. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He crossed to a side table, poured 2 glasses of water, plain, unremarkable, and set one in front of her without comment. It wasn't lost on her that he'd chosen water, that he'd poured it himself, that he set it down within her reach, and then stepped back, giving her the room to decide whether to trust it. She almost smiled. It was the smallest gesture, and it told her more about him than anything he'd said. He opened a laptop on the table between them and turned the screen so she could see it, grainy security footage from the bar at the Black Anchor, time-stamped from 2 weeks earlier. "I've had someone watching that table for 2 weeks over a rumor," he said. "Nobody on my payroll was sharp enough to catch the drop. You were." "I wasn't watching for you," she said. "I was watching for a scar." That stopped him. A scar. Quinn, above his wrist. She held up 2 fingers, drew a small shape in the air. A thin, white line shaped like a V. I've seen it before, in a file that wasn't his. Wyatt's jaw tightened, just slightly, the muscle working once beneath the skin. "Whose file?" "My brother's." She said it quietly, but it filled the room anyway. "Ethan. 2 years ago, they told me a car hit him. Nobody explained why his blood work came back with a compound no toxicologist in that hospital could name. I've spent 2 years waiting for that name to mean something. Tonight it did." He didn't offer sympathy. She noticed that and was grateful for it. Sympathy would have felt like a performance. Instead, he closed the laptop slowly, like he needed both hands occupied while he thought. "I'm not just protecting you," he said at last. His voice had lost some of its flat authority. "I need your eyes. 3 years behind that bar, you know things my own people don't. Names, faces, who sits with who." A pause. "But I won't pretend that's the only reason I brought you here." This is the moment Wyatt's motive splits into 2 layers at once. A mafia boss who needs a sharp set of eyes to survive his own world, but also a boy who was once badly hurt, quietly searching for someone worth trusting. For Leah, it's the first time in 3 years she's been valued for her mind instead of judged for her body, and that recognition, more than the safety of the penthouse, is what begins to earn his trust. A side door opened before she could answer. 2 of Wyatt's men brought Quinn in, one arm slung over a shoulder, blood already soaking dark through the leg of his trousers, where Bradford's security had shot him. They set him in a chair across the room, and under the harsher light there, Leah saw the scar again, white, thin, exactly where she remembered it from the photocopied page in Ethan's medical file. Her stomach turned once hard. Quinn didn't last long. Wyatt didn't raise his voice or his hand. He simply pulled a chair close, sat down across from him at eye level, and waited. The silence did more work than a threat would have. "The account," Wyatt said, "whose name is on it?" Quinn's eyes flicked to Leah, then away, like he couldn't hold her gaze. "Whitaker," he said finally, voice cracking. "Grant Whitaker's account. He set it up 18 months ago. Said it was for cleanup. I didn't ask what kind." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Leah felt the floor tilt slightly under her, though she hadn't moved. 18 months. The same span of time the scar had been sitting quiet on Quinn's wrist, waiting for tonight to mean something. "The same week," Wyatt said slowly, almost to himself, "that a shell company under Ellis's roots had a laundering trail somebody found and reported." He looked at Leah. "Your brother was an accountant." She nodded, throat tight. "He found something. He never told me what. 2 weeks later he was in the ER, and 6 weeks after that he stopped being able to tell anyone anything at all." Nobody spoke for a moment. Rain kept ticking against the glass. A former lieutenant of Wyatt's chose that moment to step into the room, saw Leah standing near the window, and made the mistake of sneering before he'd finished reading the room. "Boss, why bring the waitress up here? She playing dress-up in a room she's got no business being in?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Wyatt rose from his chair unhurried and crossed the space between them in 4 even steps, and set one hand briefly at Leah's waist. Not possessive, just present, an anchor. He looked the lieutenant dead in the eye, voice dropping low enough that the man had to lean in to catch it. "Don't speak about her like she isn't standing here. Again." The man's face went the color of old paper. He mumbled something that might have been an apology and found somewhere else to be. Leah's eyes stung, not from fear this time, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being defended by someone who had nothing obvious to gain from it in that moment. For the first time in 3 years, someone was holding real evidence and promising to make the people who hurt her family answer for it, and admitting in the same breath that he needed her to help him do it. Wyatt's phone rang on the table screen, lighting the dark wood beneath it. He glanced at the caller ID, and something behind his eyes went very still before he answered and put it on speaker. Grant's voice came through, calm, almost pleasant, like a man discussing dinner reservations. "I know exactly where you're hiding her." The room held its breath. Somewhere in the silence that followed, Leah understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that whatever came next wouldn't just decide her safety. It would decide whether the truth about Ethan ever saw daylight at all. Somewhere on the other end of that call was a man who had already decided Leah Sullivan wasn't allowed to survive the week, and he had no idea she'd already seen his initials once tonight. Grant hung up without another word, and the silence that followed was worse than anything he could have said. Wyatt set the phone down, slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down a weapon he's decided not to use yet. "You should sleep," he told her, though the sky outside was still black with storm. "There's a room down the hall, locked from the inside, not the outside." He said it plainly, like he understood that the distinction mattered to her more than any promise of safety would. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, 14 floors above the water, listening to the building creak faintly against the wind, replaying Grant's 4 words until they lost their shape. "I know exactly where." Near dawn, Wyatt found her, still awake, in the main room, sitting near the cold fireplace, with a blanket someone had left over the back of a chair. He didn't ask why she wasn't sleeping. He just sat down across from her, and for a while neither of them said anything. "Ethan gets moved to the best private hospital in Seattle within 48 hours, he said finally. "Every cost is mine." "Why?" she asked, not suspicious, genuinely asking. He considered the question longer than she expected. "Because somebody should have done it 2 years ago, and nobody did." A pause. "And because I know what it costs a person to spend years being the only one who believes something happened to someone they love." It wasn't an answer that explained everything, but it was an answer that told her something true, and that was enough for now. Later that morning, while Wyatt was on a call in the next room, Leah found herself alone near his desk. A drawer sat slightly open, not an invitation, just an oversight. And inside it, half buried under folded papers, was an old photograph. A boy, maybe 12 years old, bruised along one cheekbone, staring at the camera with an expression far too old for his face. She recognized the eyes before she recognized anything else. Unmistakably him. She closed the drawer gently, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't supposed to have seen. But she understood now in a way she hadn't before why a grown man covered old scars with new ink instead of simply letting them fade. The tattoos weren't decoration. They were architecture, built over something that had never been allowed to heal properly the first time. The photograph isn't there to excuse anything Wyatt has done, since it's there to explain the shape of the wall he built. For Leah, seeing it changes the register of everything that follows. She isn't just being protected by a powerful man anymore. She's standing across from someone who understands on a cellular level what it means to be underestimated and hurt by people who were supposed to be safe. By afternoon, Grant was in custody, brought in quietly without the theater Leah had braced herself for. Wyatt met him in a bare room downstairs. No audience, no performance. He opened a hidden drawer in the desk between them and slid out a single sheet of paper, handwritten, 8 months old. "Use the invisible waitress to deliver the glass. If it fails, let the cartel believe she was the one who knew too much." Leah, standing near the doorway, read it twice before the meaning fully landed. She had been a pawn on this board from the very beginning, long before tonight, long before the poisoned glass, long before she'd ever noticed the scar on Quinn's wrist. Someone had built an entire contingency plan around the assumption that nobody would ever look twice at her. It should have made her feel smaller. Instead, something in her chest went very quiet and very hard. Being underestimated was exactly what had made her impossible to predict. Under pressure, Grant gave up more than the plan. He hadn't only wanted Wyatt's territory, he admitted almost bored by his own confession. He'd wanted every trace of the shell company fraud erased because Ethan Sullivan, 2 years ago, had been the accountant who found it first, and a careful, quiet man with a spreadsheet had turned out to be more dangerous to him than any rival capo ever had. Then, smiling, even with his hands zip-tied in front of him, Grant delivered the last complication like a man setting down a winning card. He'd already passed Leah's name and photo to the same distribution contact Bradford's pipeline had quietly fed for years, with a message that read simply that she knew too much and needed to be handled. The threat was no longer contained inside one family. It was outside the walls now too. Wyatt didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't raise his voice. He picked up his phone instead, scrolling through numbers Leah didn't recognize, and began to speak calm, unhurried, almost bored himself, feeding the contact a story built entirely from financial details Leah had unknowingly memorized over 3 years behind that bar. Shipment dates, routing numbers, a pattern of skimming that framed correctly pointed every finger directly at Grant. No gun, just information placed in exactly the right hands. Before he was taken out of the room, Grant looked back at her one last time, something bitter and almost admiring in his expression. "You think he cares about you? He's just settling a debt." Leah didn't answer right away. She looked past him out toward the gray water of Elliott Bay through the rain-streaked window and let the question sit in the air a moment before she finally spoke. "Maybe it started as a debt," she said. "It doesn't have to end as one." What Grant didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that the war he'd just started wasn't going to be fought over territory at all. 3 weeks later, the private hospital room smelled like clean linen and the particular sterile quiet of a place built for recovery, not emergencies. Sunlight came in low through the blinds, striping the floor gold. Leah sat beside Ethan's bed, his hand loose in hers, and watched the machines track his pulse in slow, patient beeps. His eyes opened before his voice came back. It took him a moment to focus on her face, and when he did, something in his expression cracked open with recognition. His lips moved before any sound made it out, and then, barely above a whisper, "Grant." It was him. Leah's grip on his hand tightened. The last piece had finally landed out loud from the one person whose word mattered more than any confession Grant had given under pressure. She didn't cry. She'd used up that particular reserve weeks ago. She just nodded slow and let him see that she'd already known that he hadn't been carrying it alone this whole time, even when he couldn't speak to say so. Wyatt came by that evening, dressed down for once, sleeves rolled the way she'd first seen them. He didn't say much to Ethan, a brief, respectful nod, man to man, the kind that didn't need translation. Then he handed Leah a small USB drive, the plastic still warm from his pocket. "Grant giving the order," he said quietly. "Audio, calm as anything, making sure neither of you survive to talk." She listened to the whole recording alone that night, in the hospital's small family lounge, headphones in back, straight against a plastic chair that wasn't built for comfort. She didn't cry this time either. She simply closed her hand around the drive when it ended until her knuckles went white and understood that some kinds of grief eventually calcify into something closer to resolve. That same night, Wyatt called every capo still loyal to him into the penthouse. Attendance wasn't optional, and the room filled slowly with men who clearly understood that whatever this meeting was, it wasn't a suggestion. Glasses of scotch sat untouched on the sideboard. Nobody reached for them. When the room went quiet, not asked to just quiet, the way rooms go still around certain men, Wyatt placed one hand on Leah's shoulder in front of all of them. She felt every eye in the room land on her at once, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the urge to shrink under the weight of being looked at. "From tonight, Leah Sullivan doesn't answer to anyone in this room," he said, voice low enough that every man had to lean in to catch it. "Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." A beat. His hand didn't move from her shoulder. "She's not staff. She's the reason I'm alive to be standing here at all." Wyatt doesn't need to announce this in front of an entire room of power. Strategically, silence would be safer, but the wounded boy still inside him needs the whole world to witness what he's about to do, as if publicly protecting someone else could finally heal an old private wound. For Leah, this isn't the moment she gets rescued. It's the moment she stops needing to save herself in silence. No one in the room met his eyes. Grant was let out sometime after, quiet now, whatever bravado he'd carried into custody long since spent. Word reached the right people before morning. The matter was closed, and it had been closed on Wyatt's terms. Leah stood in that room afterward, alone for a moment, while the others filed out, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have an easy name for. Not triumph exactly, something steadier. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the opposite of invisible. She had become the one line in Seattle's underworld that nobody dared cross. Later on the rooftop terrace, the storm had finally thinned to a soft, steady rain, the kind that didn't demand anything of you, just fell. City lights blurred gold and white below them, the sound dark and endless past the last row of buildings. Wyatt didn't say anything else. He just took her hand, the same hand that used to shake, carrying a serving tray through a room full of men who never once looked at her twice, and held it. She didn't pull away. She felt the rain collect at her collar and didn't mind it. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she needed to make herself smaller to fit the room she was standing in. There was no more the waitress. There was only Leah, the woman who had saved his life, and the one a mafia boss was willing to burn a city down to protect. In the end, this story is about what happens when someone finally sees the parts of you the rest of the world walked past. Leah didn't change who she was to earn Wyatt's protection. She'd been carrying the same quiet strength the whole time. Nobody had simply bothered to look. If you're sitting with your coffee this morning, feeling like the people around you only notice what you can do for them, here's something practical. Pick one person this week, a neighbor, a grandchild, the clerk at the store who always looks tired, and ask them a real question. Not, how are you, but what's been hard lately? Most people never get asked that. It costs 10 minutes, and it might be the first time in months someone's felt truly seen. And if you're the one who feels invisible, write down 3 things you know that nobody else in your life knows. That memory, that attention, that history you carry. It's worth more than anyone's given you credit for. Keep the list where you'll find it on a hard day. Being underestimated isn't a life sentence. Sometimes it's simply proof the world hasn't finished learning what you're capable of yet. What did you think of Leah's transformation from the woman nobody looked at twice to the woman an empire was built around protecting? Tell us in the comments. If this story moved you like it, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for the next story.